Welcome to Canonical, the podcast that takes literature out of the classroom. I'm James Shao, and with me are my co-hosts Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Yo. Hey.
Today we are finishing up our discussion of The Garlic Ballads by Mo Yan, the last book in our series Life Under Communism. Our discussion today may contain spoilers. We previously posted a spoiler-free episode where we reviewed the book. You can check that out in our archives. Next week, we will discuss all the books that we've read for the series, including this book, as well as László Krasznahorkai's Satantango and Herta Muller's The Passport. If you would like to chat with us, you can find us on social media at CanonicalPod and on Reddit at rCanonicalPod.
In some previous episodes, like our Chinese science fiction series, we, or at least I, may have taken some authors like Liu Cixin to task for their political stances. But I want to discuss whether that's fair. When Mo Yan won the Nobel in 2012, there was a big debate over whether he deserved the prize. Some critics cited his leadership role in the government-run Chinese Writers Association, while others pointed to his participation in the creation of a handwritten anniversary edition of Mao's 1942 talks at the Yan'an Forum on Literature and Art, which are largely blamed for the culture of repression in Chinese literature and art. I think these things are worth scrutiny, but I want to ask, do you think that's the whole story? Can we condemn him the same way, for example, that our previous writer, Herta Muller, did when she cited the horrors of living under a repressive socialist regime and suggesting that Mo Yan's complicit in Chinese political repression?
I mean, if you were a typical writer doing typical things, I would say that we are too critical of his Nobel Prize win. But the things that he does, because we don't know all of what he's up to, we don't know his entire life, but some of the things that he does are so symbolically resonant that they cast a shadow over his whole career. So to me, I think it's still fair to criticize him for what he's done, specifically hand copying the talks at Yan'an. I think that that is a very symbolically loaded thing to do, and I don't think that that's something that we should let him have a pass on.
My question is that something he could have begged out of? Because he does hold a leadership position. Could he refuse to do it? I would say probably yes. I think if he didn't want to do it, he probably could have just said, I don't want to do this, or found someone else to do it, which in my mind makes it worse. But if he was compelled to do it, if, there's this threat to, maybe not on his life, because other people have done way worse in China and have lived, but some kind of threat to his well-being.
Like, could they have quashed his career as a writer?
Yeah, so that's my question is, there are plenty of dissident writers who have made their stand and as a result are banned from entering the country. I feel like that is something that we have to keep in mind, because if he was compelled to do it, and once again, we don't know, that's part of the problem, is we don't know if he was compelled or if he is a full-throated believer in celebrating Mao and the talks at Yan'an. So I think that does color how we might understand his actions.
Here, I think there's something that's worth sharing, because actually your position, James, is similar to a professor of Chinese at the University of Virginia, I believe. His name is Charles Laughlin. And in an article, an unpublished article, he says basically this: criticizing Mo Yan's participation in the handwritten talks implies that Mo Yan was supposed to conspicuously refuse to participate in this unremarkable act of political ritual. He goes on to say that this is the same sort of thing that a lot of people do in China, and it doesn't mean anything. He says this is a mild gesture of patriotism, even less surprising when performed by a leader of the government's Writers' Association. Does such an act really imply an affirmation of Mao's worst atrocities? And then the final passage, I think, is also really important. Laughlin says, Mo Yan is a literary man. but he is also a government official. And in this latter capacity, one would expect him to perform any number of inane, meaningless, and harmless ritual activities and observances. So, to this type of response, I would say possibly yes. By being a government official, you may have certain expectations that you have to meet, but is that something that we can square with being a writer of serious fiction?
The problem I have with that response, even though I do kind of agree with it to a degree, the problem I have with it is it's presenting it as if he had no thought to what this meant and he didn't really think too deeply of it. It's kind of like, here's something I have to do as part of my job. Here I go scribbling away. I find it hard to believe that a person doing this will not put some thought into what it means to do it, no matter how serious of a writer you are. I mean, if you're just the regular bureaucrat, then sure. Yeah, you do all that kind of crap all the time in China. But as someone who's a writing, thinking person, I think he must have thought about what this meant. So that's why, for me, it's less of this kind of thoughtless task and more of how much he is compelled to do so.
I guess what Laughlin is saying is that because it happens so frequently, it doesn't really mean much. And if he chose not to do it, that would be more conspicuous. But I don't think that it is meaningless. But even if it were meaningless, if people are not able to choose which activities they participate in, how can they have intellectual or moral authority? And if being a government official means that Mo Yan must do what people expect of him, does that mean that being a literary man is incompatible with being a government official?
I'm going to sidestep that question for a minute by also pointing out that in that same article, Laughlin talks about how maybe too much symbolism is put on top of those talks, that those talks maybe should not be looked at as among the worst of Mao's policies, and that the subject matter that it calls for writers to embrace the ruralness of China, that actually goes in line also with Mo Yan's style of writing.
They say that, but they say a whole lot more than that. And I think that it's fair to say that these are things that we should study and we should remember and we should learn from, but copying them by hand is quite different from studying them as a text with historical significance. It's more of a celebration or a veneration. And the comparison that I think is worth making, especially in light of China's reforms, it's like making a new statue of Robert E. Lee to replace the one that was torn down in Richmond. Like, why would you do that? What does it mean to do that?
I had a different kind of comparison. I think it is like that of a sort, in that Robert E. Lee is reviled by certain people in the world. But I think the problem here is the person, Mao Zedong, is really complicated as a political figure. Like in China, you would probably say he's more like Thomas Jefferson than Robert E. Lee. Thomas Jefferson had a lot of problems too. Obviously, he did not commit as many atrocities as Mao Zedong, but at the same time, if you talk to people in China, they don't think that Mao committed as many atrocities as he is portrayed in Western history. So how can you square that? Because if he is someone who grew up in China and has a different understanding of who this political figure is than ours, I mean, how much fault do you ascribe to this action, and how much harm does this action do, is a question that's worth considering. Because I don't think that we can, all three of us were raised and grew up in the US, and we have our Western perspective of Mao, which is more or less historically accurate, but it lacks a lot of context that people in China lived through. So I think it is difficult for those of us who don't grow up in China to have that kind of context and understand what he means. At the same time, the people in China who have had history censored, they don't know the full historical picture of what he did. So it's kind of like this situation where neither has a perspective that's as whole as it can be. And that's what makes it complicated when you start saying, well, he copied something that a genocidal maniac, for example. Like, people have talked about Mao in that way. He copied a text that's written by a genocidal maniac. I mean, people in China don't view him that way. They view him like a Jefferson or a Washington. So it gets really, really complicated when you start venturing into what this text means and what Mao means. And when you factor in the fact that he grew up in the countryside as a peasant, that also adds an extra layer. So in the end, I'd say, like, with this, I don't know, because I lack that perspective. So I feel a little bit bad for his position, because I think you can't escape your upbringing. And he grew up during the Cultural Revolution. Like, he's a little bit younger than my parents, and my parents' generation grew up during the Cultural Revolution like he did. And they argue amongst each other about what Mao did and whether what he did was right or wrong. Like, there are family squabbles between my uncles who won't talk to each other because they disagree about the merits and demerits of what Mao did. So I think the problem is, one of the underlying assumptions we have from a Western perspective is we just think Mao is bad and he's done something bad. And that is also an unthinking perspective, because I think we are not challenging the complexities of that situation when we consider it and just say it's bad.
I think that it's true that neither side has the complete picture of Mao, but I don't think that the decision whether or not to hand copy the talks are a matter of us evaluating him or not, but rather we can evaluate the talks themselves and what they mean. And when we look at the content of the talks, they are not worthy of being celebrated in and of themselves, regardless of who wrote them. And for Mo Yan to choose to copy them by hand, perhaps it's not fair to say it's like creating a statue of Robert E. Lee, because that's a person, but he is venerating a text that is not worth venerating. He is putting his name beside something that really undermines his moral credibility or his intellectual credibility, in my eyes at least. And I think that's what makes a person like Herta Muller's criticism worth listening to.
My question to that is, what if someone copies, I think it's the Constitution where they talk about blacks being 3/5 of a person. Like, if someone were to copy that, they're copying a national document. I mean, this is obviously less important than, like, the Chinese Constitution, which has been revised like 15 times. But you're copying something that's morally reprehensible. But people do it. Should they not?
They should. They should not do it. Like, if somebody like Toni Morrison, who I think has some level of moral authority, said, I am not going to copy this document because it was written by Thomas Jefferson and he was a rapist and a slave owner, I would say that that's a righteous stand to take, and I would support her in doing so. I guess the context here that I would say is important is, in other contexts, that is a stand that people can take and are able to take. In the Chinese context, perhaps Laughlin is right that, that conspicuous refusal would just cause a lot of trouble for him. But why should we accept that as par for the course? Why is that something that we say is reasonable?
I wanted to interject a little bit by asking or bringing up another quote. In his Nobel acceptance speech, Mo Yan said, "The best way to speak is by writing. You will find everything I need to say in my works." And I think this was meant to put distance between anything he might say in person or be forced to say in person, whether it's in an interview or an action like this copying of the text we're talking about. But is that just a cop-out? Is it fair to judge an author by things that are not authorly?
He wants license to be incoherent. He wants license to say one thing one time and say something else another time.
Do we hold all writers to this same moral fortitude, though?
I would say no. I would say that the Nobel Prize is not, like, the prize committee does not have clean hands. But by saying that other people have broken the rules or broken the moral rules before doesn't mean that we should accept when somebody else does it. It's still wrong when Mo Yan does it, and we should be even more vigilant when everybody does it.
Yeah, to clarify, I also don't think that it's a good thing to do. But I think what I push back against is it being a black and white, absolutely wrong thing to do. because I think there's just a lot of cultural context that's missing. And very often, when we discuss things that are evil, for example, we want to say, well, this is obviously bad, because it's easy for us to say that and say, well, I don't need the context. Just give it to me straight, good or bad. And the problem is, I think in this situation, you have the political context of him as a government official having to do this, but you also have the context of Mao being a difficult person to really understand in terms of his culpability in his leadership. So you couple all that together, it just makes it very complicated. And this idea of copying is also culturally complicated because during the Cultural Revolution and earlier and later, people were punished by having to copy text. If you were someone who was a landowning class member or someone who was a counter-revolutionary, you had to copy confessions, right? You had to copy things on signs that said you were an evil threat to the state. This idea of copying as punishment is something that is a part of the life of someone who grew up during the Cultural Revolution. So even the idea of copying has context that extends beyond our understanding because we didn't grow up during that time.
He actually has a story that he wrote in 1989 called Abandoned Child that kind of addresses this question that we're talking about, where, if I remember right, I think that is a case of where someone is forced to copy a confession that is not truthful. And so that story ends up being sort of about how being forced to copy someone else's words is not the same as choosing what to write.
And you couple that with the fact that Chinese education has a lot of rote memorization and copying as part of their education too. So even the act of copying in Chinese society, in Chinese culture, is also meaningfully different, I think, than how we might envision. Like, we would never assign someone to copy something, right? Like, we wouldn't assign a bureaucrat to copy the state charter or whatever. I mean, it's just not something we do. I mean, with all that said, I still think I wouldn't have done it. And I think it doesn't make him look good, that's for sure. But I think the people who criticize him for that, they draw a very strong line and they say, you should not do this because I wouldn't have done it. That's always what it comes down to, is the part that's unsaid is you shouldn't do it because I wouldn't have.
Yes, but I mean, that's the same thing with any kind of evaluation of other people's actions. Basically, you evaluate it in terms of whether one should do this, and then that one ends up being, would I personally do it? Should people in general do it? So that's not really distinct from the way we would criticize somebody doing anything that we think is wrong.
Well, no, but if you take Herta Muller, for example, she has an example of this in her past where she refused to copy what someone was saying, and she got in trouble for it, but she stood by those actions. She does have a leg to stand on. However, I think James is right that there is cultural context that Muller did not have.
Yes, there is cultural context that would deepen your understanding, but I think that it would require something incredibly substantial to say it would not only deepen your understanding, but contravene the way you understood it and force you to change your position. And I think just in this conversation, we've already talked about quite a bit of context, but I think the even larger issue for me is Mo Yan is in a position where if he refuses to do something, he is conspicuous in his refusal, but he put himself in that position. So it's kind of like working for the mob. Like at first, it's just drinking old fashions and playing backgammon or whatever. But eventually, you know they're going to ask you to do something that you don't want to do. And if you want to have a clean moral conscience, you don't work for the mob. And so basically, for him to agree to be in a leadership position in the China Writers Association, he should have expected this was coming to him.
So let's bring this back to the text for a bit. Do you feel that this is a pro-China novel? Do you think he has any broad strokes that he uses to paint China in a positive or a negative or at least complicated light?
When you say pro-China, do you mean pro-Chinese government?
I don't know that I want to clarify that at all.
Okay. Interesting tactic.
I mean, because there's multiple things going on here, right? You could look at it as pro-China as a country of people, or pro-Chinese government, or I'm leaving that up to interpretation.
Well, I'm interpreting it as pro-Republic of China,
Damn, you got me.
Taiwan
Yeah.
province.
I'm going to
And
say,
I'd say no.
Yeah.
Oh,
I would say my question, well, it matters in one sense, it doesn't matter in the other sense, because I would say it is not anti-China in the sense of the people in the country, but it's also not anti-China in terms of the Chinese government. I think that it is trying to be particular and pointing to a particular event and particular people, but I think that he would probably say it's a mistake to extend it beyond those circumstances.
My actual way of interpreting this question is, does this present a critique of the government or the state? And I'd say yes, but he critiques the state, even though the book was banned, in a way that's more acceptable, because he doesn't critique the foundational nature of the CCP. He critiques the kind of corruption in bureaucracy that is commonly known and understood in China. So his critique isn't revolutionary, because he's not saying overthrow the state. What he's saying is, this is the state, but here are some bad apples. And I think if you have the perspective that the CCP is evil, then I think you would be kind of disappointed in how he's critiquing the state, because he isn't critiquing the foundational nature of how the government's set up and its repression. But at the same time, I mean, he does show you the violence of the state. The problem I think people might have, those of you who are, anti-CCP, is that they would want him to go further, and he just doesn't take those last couple of steps.
Yeah, he never has an epiphany, the main character. He never has an epiphany where he says, oh, the whole system is a lie or the whole system is wrong. It's very, very narrowly drawn. These specific people have done something wrong.
Well, I think I was going to say the problem is, but I'm not going to say that, because I don't think it's a problem in that it's not a bug. I think Moyen believes this. I think he believes that these people are bad. And it comes across in his writing that these are kind of bumpkins who accidentally let a prisoner get his head bashed in by a car or whatever. And, they failed to arrest a person, and they don't know how to provide humane treatment. And when there's an actual educated nurse or the warden, those actual educated people of authority, they're presented in a positive light. So I don't know if it's a limitation as much as it's how he himself feels about the government.
is there much hidden imagery that might suggest nuance in any of this? I wanted to bring up the sensory and body imagery that we talked about in a previous episode. There's a Russian philosopher named Mikhail Bakhtin who came up with the idea of the carnival in writing like this. Gary Saul Morrison and Carol Emerson wrote about how debasement and mockery are idealized in a special carnivalistic image, the grotesque body. Thus, carnival banishes fear of individual pain and death, for the grotesque body is cosmic and universal. If socialist realist art emphasizes the clean, closed-off, and narcissistic body, the art of the grotesque stresses change, mediation, and the ability to surprise. So this feels separate to me from socialist realist art in that way, that it seems to embrace the gross human body. We've talked about the farts, the piss, the shit, the vomit, etc. Does that point to anything further or more complicated in this book?
I would say it may not have the political import that perhaps the authors intended. I would say that he is an earthy writer, like he likes to write about sensual things and bodily things. And I don't think that he writes about those things in order to signify anything political, but just to show, hey, I'm just an average sort of salt of the earth sort of guy. Like that's his sensibility rather than his political sensibility. I'm going to say that it doesn't mean anything politically because even though it's different from socialist realism, the difference doesn't amount to much because Jackie Chan also is a filmmaker and his films are definitely not socialist realism, but he is a diehard CCP guy. So clearly it doesn't mean anything.
And those are also full of farts and blood.
That's true.
Maybe not as much piss, but
In some ways, Jackie Chan's support of the CCP is worse because he's doing it solely for the money. I mean, he could always choose to live in the US and he'll be just as famous, but he won't have access to the Chinese market.
I want to ask you about one last thing.
Thank God.
How do you interpret Mo Yan's inclusion of the young officer Zheng Changinian's defense at the end of the book? This is during the trial section.
In that section, it's revealed that he is a character that Gao Yong had met earlier on the night that fourth uncle had died. And he was this officer out in the fields, and he had beautiful white teeth, and he shared an expensive cigarette with Gao Yong, and he made just this very positive impression. And then he shows up at the end of the novel, and he's very well spoken, and he talks about goodness, and he talks about everything. He's just like this perfect character, right? To me, it's like saying to the reader, hey, listen, there are some bad people in the world, but there also are some good people in the world. I think Mo Yan is basically trying to show a balance.
I think some people would read the significance of him being an army officer as some kind of whatever the opposite of repudiation is of the state. It's not a celebration of the state. It's more like the state can function and uphold its values. I think you could read it that way, but the problem is I don't know if Mo Yan is really intending it that way because we've talked before about how he's not especially thoughtful in certain aspects of his writing. But because he does focus so much on him being an officer, I kind of feel like, I'm really on the fence about this. You might say of two minds. I really don't know if he includes this fact of him being an officer because it is in some way celebrating the people, the good people who make up the CCP, the government.
For me, it felt very clear that it was supposed to be this kind of upholding of what the CCP supposedly stands for.
It's what it should be, I think, the ideal of the CCP versus the inept bumbling cops.
Right. In part because he's only mentioned by name a couple times. Most of the time he's referred to as the young officer. I feel like that is kind of really pushing a sort of image that you're supposed to get from this character.
I think he is a character who's meant to represent goodness in general, and I think that he is supposed to represent something pure and decent inside the central government. And I think in this way, Mo Yan kind of fits in with this common Western critique that the Chinese government is willing to show incompetence at lower levels, but at higher levels, it's important that there be positive images shown. I think that this novel could be kind of seen as in the same spirit as this Chinese TV series that came out a few years ago, In the Name of the People, which is also about incompetence and corruption at the level of a Chinese city. But the hero of the show is a party secretary who uncovers the corruption and prosecutes the corruption. So I think the extent of Chinese censorship to just say nothing bad is shown is wrong, but rather something bad is shown in order to show the higher level good guys fixing it.
I think you can take both sides of the argument that we talked about earlier, how context matters, but at the same time, this style of fiction seems very in line with everything that comes out of China, where local government or local authority is corrupt and problematic, but it's always a hero at the top level. It's always central government is doing what's right for the people. And that seems like a very propagandist sort of thing.
I mean, do you think it's untrue?
Well, I mean, I have a very Western point of view, and I think in the West, we tend to be more skeptical about what our central government is doing, what our federal government is doing.
Well, I think it is true that the central government in China will prosecute corruption and wrongdoing at the local levels. And I think it is also true, factually, that the central government will prosecute people in the central government who are not as well connected for committing these kinds of crimes. But the question is, who watches these watchers at the very top?
Who watches the Watchmen?
Yes. I mean, in the case of President Xi, who watches the watch bear? Like, who's watching him? You know, if he decides to abscond with a certain percentage of the defense budget or whatever, or gets a kickback, like, can anyone prosecute him? Probably no, right? And along with the people who are in the standing committee of whatever that's called, if they're on the outs, then yes, I mean, they'll get prosecuted as they have in the past. But it depends on the political favor, right? It depends on who's well connected, who's in power. So that's the greater issue. But to your question, Ed, I'd say that it's not untrue. People do get prosecuted for corruption in China, and all the time, but it's not equal.
People will use these corruption trials and they will use the evidence of, talk of corruption in the media as a point to show that China is really free and open and transparent. But I think you can still quite easily find things that would never be available in China. You would never see for example, an Aaron Brockovich type narrative where you have an individual not affiliated with the government who's a whistleblower who uncovers corruption. And you would never have a documentary like Citizen 4, where somebody like Edward Snowden is valorized as a good person. It would never happen. The person who always solves the problem has to be a person in the system, not somebody outside of the system, because the system needs to be preserved at all costs.
See, the thing is, and this is what I think is quite interesting about this officer, because you can argue that even though he's a PLA officer, he's not really in the system the same way that the people in the justice system are. And I also think this is not something we talked about in our review episode, but the historical context of this book is interesting. We touched on the fact that it was published in, I think, 1987, and then was banned after Tiananmen, and then was unbanned in the 90s. But what's interesting is I think this is a book that is very symbolic of that time, because you have a character like Zheng Changinian who is kind of like a young idealistic protester, the kind of person who would maybe go to Beijing and protest the, unfairness of certain legal systems. And the fact that this happened a few years before Tiananmen, I think people forget that the China of today is very different from the China pre-Tiananmen, because you could do it. I mean, people were pushing the limits, right? These are the dissidents who got kicked out of the country or were imprisoned. Like, these were people who were doing that kind of, not investigative journalism, but protesting and, bringing light to the ills of the government and looking for reform. They were present in the 80s, and they were trying to see how far they could push their calls for reform.
That I would say is true, but I think in the context of this novel, it's less true than the conflict between local and higher level government that we've been talking about. Because early in the novel, when I don't recall if it's Gao Ma or Gao Yang is arrested, he's criticizing the police officers, saying, you've broken this law, you've broken that law. And when Gao Ma wants to marry Jinju, one of the things that he frequently talks about is how the family is in violation of the marriage law. So you have these sympathetic characters who are always pointing to the law of the country as a source of goodness or as a source of moral authority. So you consistently have this image that the government of the country is good, and where things deviate and go wrong is because they deviate from the country.
Yeah, but that's not very different from the Tiananmen protests. People interpret wrongly, I think, that the Tiananmen protest is about bringing down the CCP, but it wasn't. It's about opening up the country and asking for elections and democratic reform. Even if you look at what people were saying, young people at the time, they weren't saying the CCP was bad or that the government was doing a bad job. They were saying that they wanted the government to address their concerns about democratization or about corruption or about whatever. So it's still not that different. I mean, in terms of this book encapsulating what young reformists were thinking, it's really not that far off, I think.
That's true. I guess the only thing I will say to that is that when you have Galma talking about these things, he's not talking about reform. He's not asking for something that doesn't already exist. He's talking about a law which is already present, that he accepts.
I think the only thing you could touch on is the rioting at the local council or whatever. It's the county seat. If you understand that as a political protest of sorts. It's not really presented as one. It's almost like this happened by accident.
You could say that these are people who don't really have a strong political consciousness. When they riot against the government, they're not doing it because it's the government. They're doing it because these are the people who are not giving them the money that they want. Like, their understanding of the situation is very transactional. It's very pragmatic.
Even when they go to arrest Gao Yang at the beginning, he says, "Oh, that's illegal?" Maybe he's saying that because he's trying to downplay it, but maybe he just isn't thinking about it as an attack on the government. He's just mad, like Iad said. He's mad that he got cheated out of a deal.
All right, we'll stop here. Thank you for listening. If you would like to let us know what you thought about this book or this discussion, you can let us know on Reddit or on social media at CanonicalPod. You can give us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. That would help us a lot. Next week, we'll be wrapping up this series. We'll talk about all three of the books that we discussed here. Those are the Garlic Ballads, Satantango, and The Passport. Till then, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.